When we step into intimacy, one of the first emotions we feel is safety. It's that sense of finally being able to exhale, of knowing someone sees us in ways no one else does. And safety is beautiful, it's necessary, but here's the paradox. It can also blind us. We start to mistake that feeling of security for a guarantee, and that's where things begin to get dangerous. Because when we feel safe, we sometimes stop questioning, we stop noticing, and we stop protecting ourselves in the ways we used to. Think about how cautious we are when we first meet someone. We pay attention to every word, every action, every little inconsistency. If something doesn't feel right, we catch it quickly. But the moment we build intimacy, that vigilance fades. We no longer see things as they are. We see them through the lens of connection. And when that connection feels good, it's easy to ignore the things that might one day break us. It could be subtle disrespect, small lies, dismissive tones, or even a pattern of neglect that in the early days would have been unacceptable, but now, wrapped in the blanket of intimacy, gets rationalized away. What's really happening is that the brain starts to equate closeness with safety, and once we feel safe, we relax the boundaries that once protected us. And while intimacy should be a place where we can lower our guard, it becomes dangerous when that lowered guard allows us to accept less than we deserve. That's why so many people wake up one day in a relationship they barely recognize, asking themselves, how did I let it get this far? The answer is often that safety created blindness. When you feel safe with someone, you want to believe the best about them. You want to assume their intentions are pure, even when their actions don't match their words. You tell yourself, they didn't mean it, or it's not that big of a deal. Slowly, excuses pile up, and before you know it, the line between forgiveness and self-betrayal has blurred. That's the dark side of intimacy people rarely talk about, the way it can cause us to silence our intuition. Intuition is sharp when we're strangers. It's sharp when we're still figuring someone out. But in intimacy, it softens. We convince ourselves that love is about overlooking flaws, about being understanding, about giving chances. And of course, love requires all of those things, but only to a point. The problem is when safety makes us confuse acceptance with tolerance of the unacceptable. This illusion of safety can also make us stay far longer than we should. Once intimacy is established, walking away doesn't feel like walking away from a person. It feels like walking away from home. That sense of comfort makes us endure things we wouldn't tolerate otherwise, all because the thought of losing that safety feels scarier than losing ourselves. And yet, the truth is that if intimacy blinds us to what's really happening, then we aren't actually safe at all. We're simply shielded by a false sense of protection, one that makes us vulnerable in the worst way possible, vulnerable to being hurt by the very person we trusted most. The hardest part is that none of this happens in big, obvious moments. It happens in small increments. It's the raised voice you brushed off, the broken promise you forgave too quickly, the selfish decision you excused because they said they were stressed. Each time, you tell yourself it's not worth making a scene. Each time, you trade your clarity for comfort. And each time, you move a little further away from the version of yourself that once knew how to spot danger. That's why awareness matters so much. Intimacy should be a safe place, but it should never make you abandon the wisdom that kept you safe before. Safety isn't about ignoring red flags. It's about knowing you can trust someone without silencing your instincts. The dark side of intimacy is when safety becomes blindness, when the very thing that should protect you ends up being the reason you no longer protect yourself. And that's why in every relationship, the challenge is to balance the warmth of safety with the clarity of awareness, because love should make you feel secure, but it should never cost you your ability to see the truth. Dependency is one of those things that sneaks in quietly when intimacy deepens. At first, it feels natural, even beautiful, to lean on someone. You share your victories, your fears, your secrets, and you feel lighter because there's someone there to hold the weight with you. That closeness builds trust, and trust feels like oxygen in a relationship. But here's the subtle trap. What begins as healthy reliance can turn into unhealthy dependency without you even realizing it. And that's when intimacy starts to take on a darker shade. The moment we begin to rely on another person for validation, for happiness, or even for our sense of self, we give away a piece of our power. It's not obvious at first. Maybe it starts with needing them to reassure us when we're insecure, or looking to them for constant reminders that we're loved. But over time, that reassurance stops being a bonus and becomes a requirement. You no longer feel enough unless they say you are. You no longer feel worthy unless they confirm it. And when that happens, the relationship stops being about two whole people coming together. It becomes about survival, about needing the other person just to feel okay. The danger is that dependency feels so similar to love. When you crave their presence, when you can't imagine your life without them, when your mood rises and falls based on how they treat you, it feels like passion. But what it really is imbalance. True love should amplify who you already are, not replace the parts of yourself you've abandoned. Yet dependency convinces you that without them, you're incomplete. And that illusion is powerful enough to keep people trapped in relationships that are damaging, unfulfilling, or even toxic, because the thought of losing that person feels like losing oxygen. What makes this so complicated is that intimacy creates a kind of emotional merging. You start to share not just moments, but identities. Their pain becomes your pain, their joy becomes your joy. And while that connection is profound, it also blurs the boundary between support and reliance. Before long, you're not just leaning on them, you're leaning into them so much that standing on your own feels impossible. And once you forget how to stand alone, you'll tolerate almost anything just to avoid the terror of being left unsupported. Dependency also breeds fear. The deeper it grows, the stronger the fear of abandonment becomes. Suddenly, you're not just in a relationship, you're in a constant battle to make sure it never ends. You start sacrificing parts of yourself to keep the peace. You bite your tongue when you want to speak. You give in when you know you should resist. You allow things you never would have allowed before. And all of it is driven by one silent thought. If I lose them, I lose myself. That's the dark side nobody wants to talk about. And here's the cruel irony. Dependency doesn't make love stronger, it weakens it. Because when your happiness depends entirely on another person, you put a weight on the relationship it can't possibly carry. They become responsible not only for their own life, but for holding up yours as well. That pressure can suffocate love, turning what should be freedom and choice into obligation and burden. Love thrives when it's given freely, not when it's demanded out of fear of collapse. The truth is, the healthiest relationships are the ones where both people are whole on their own, where intimacy adds joy, but isn't the sole source of it, where you can lean on each other without collapsing if the other steps away. Dependency masquerades as devotion, but it strips you of independence, and without independence, there can be no genuine choice, no genuine freedom to love. Because real love isn't about needing someone to survive. It's about wanting someone to share your already meaningful life with. One of the most overlooked costs of intimacy is the quiet erosion of individuality. In the early stages of a relationship, two people come together with distinct identities, unique passions, interests, friendships, routines. But as intimacy deepens, those lines can blur. You begin to adapt, to compromise, to mold yourself around the rhythm of the relationship. At first, it feels like closeness, like unity, like the natural merging that love brings. But slowly, without even noticing, you can lose sight of who you were before this person came into your life. It starts in small ways. You give up a hobby because they're not interested in it. You stop spending as much time with friends because your partner prefers staying in. You alter your routines to accommodate theirs, convincing yourself that love is about prioritizing the relationship above all else. None of these choices feel dramatic in the moment, But stacked over time, they create a version of you that looks very different from the person who first entered the relationship. The tragedy is that the very qualities that made you attractive in the beginning, the energy, the independence, the uniqueness, are the first things to get buried. The dark side of intimacy here is that closeness can be mistaken for sameness. You start to think, if we really love each other, we should want the same things, do the same things, live the same way. And while shared values are crucial, individuality is just as important. Without it, intimacy becomes suffocating rather than liberating. You no longer feel like two people choosing each other freely. You feel like one fused identity where personal space no longer exists. This loss of individuality is dangerous because it leads to quiet resentment. Even if you don't realize it right away, some part of you begins to miss the person you used to be. You might not even be able to articulate it. You just feel restless, uninspired, or drained. It's the part of you that remembers the passions you abandoned, the friendships you neglected, the goals you put on pause. And when that part of you is silenced for too long, it eventually erupts, often in ways that damage the relationship. Another cost is that when individuality fades, dependency grows stronger. You stop seeing yourself as a whole person and start defining yourself only in relation to your partner. Instead of saying, "This is who I am and this is who I love," it becomes, "I am who I am because of who I love." That may sound romantic, but in reality, it leaves you vulnerable. If the relationship falters, you're not just losing them, you're losing yourself, because you no longer know who you are outside of them. That's why so many people, after a breakup, say they feel like they've lost their identity. It wasn't just the relationship ending, it was the shattering of the self they'd abandoned. The truth is, intimacy should never mean disappearing. It should mean being fully yourself and being fully accepted for it. The healthiest relationships are ones where both people have room to grow as individuals, not shrink into a single identity. Because when two strong, independent people come together, the relationship doesn't diminish them. It magnifies them. It becomes a partnership where individuality is celebrated, not erased. The dark side nobody talks about is that in the name of love, people often sacrifice the very essence of who they are. They stop nurturing their own dreams, their own friendships, their own voice. And while they may think they're strengthening the bond, what they're really doing is weakening the foundation, because a relationship built on the loss of self will eventually collapse under the weight of unspoken resentment and unmet potential. True intimacy isn't about becoming one person. It's about staying two people who choose each other day after day without losing the parts that make each of you whole. One of the most vulnerable parts of intimacy is the act of opening up. When we let someone in, we give them access to the sides of us that the world rarely sees. We share our fears, our insecurities, our regrets, our deepest wounds. We allow them to step behind the polished version of ourselves that we show to everyone else. And in that moment, it feels like freedom, like finally being understood, finally being seen without judgment. That kind of vulnerability is the very heartbeat of intimacy. But here lies a darker truth. The same vulnerability that brings closeness can, if misused, become a weapon in the wrong hands. It doesn't always start with cruelty. Sometimes it begins with a careless comment, a joke made in poor taste, a throwaway remark that touches the very nerve you once trusted them with. You laugh it off, you tell yourself they didn't mean harm, but something inside you shifts. That sacred trust that once felt unshakable suddenly has a crack in it. Other times, it's not careless at all. It's deliberate. It's your partner throwing your deepest confession back at you during an argument, using it as ammunition to win, to shame, or to control. And in that moment, you realize that intimacy has a darker edge. The more someone knows about you, the more power they hold to hurt you. The real danger is not just in the moment of betrayal, but in what it does to your ability to trust moving forward. When someone weaponizes your vulnerability, it plants a seed of fear. You begin to second guess how much of yourself you should share. You hesitate before speaking. You censor your feelings, not because you don't feel them, but because you're afraid of how they might be used against you later. What once was an open space of honesty becomes a careful dance of self-protection, and slowly, intimacy dies, not because love disappeared, but because fear took its place. This is the dark side nobody talks about. Vulnerability is both the bridge and the risk. Without it, relationships stay shallow. With it, they have depth, but they also carry the potential for devastation if that trust is broken. That's why so many people carry scars long after the relationship ends. It's not just the breakup that hurts, it's the betrayal of trust. It's realizing that the secrets you shared in confidence became weapons in conflict. It's the sting of knowing that the person you trusted most used your truth against you. The cost of that betrayal extends beyond one relationship. It can change the way you approach all future connections. You build walls higher. You let people in more slowly, or sometimes not at all. You tell yourself you're just being cautious, but deep down it's fear of repeating the same mistake, fear of being vulnerable again, only to be punished for it. And while those walls may protect you, they also isolate you. They prevent you from ever experiencing the kind of intimacy you crave, because intimacy without vulnerability is impossible. What makes this especially dangerous is how subtle it can be. A sarcastic remark, an eye roll when you're sharing something painful, a dismissive laugh when you're serious. These moments seem small, but each one chips away at the foundation of trust. And once that foundation is weakened, every act of openness feels risky. You begin to question not only your partner's intentions, but your own judgment. Was I wrong to trust them? Was I foolish to open up? And that self-doubt can be even more damaging than the betrayal itself. But here's the paradox: even knowing the risks, we can't escape the fact that vulnerability is the lifeblood of intimacy. Without it, there is no real connection. The challenge is not to avoid opening up, but to choose carefully who we open up to, and to set boundaries that protect us even in closeness. Because when intimacy is healthy, vulnerability is honored, not exploited. It's held with care, not wielded as a weapon. And when intimacy turns dark, it's almost always because that sacred responsibility was broken. The truth is, every time we let someone in, we take a risk. That's the price of intimacy. But the darkest side of all is when the risk you took in the name of love becomes the very reason you struggle to love again. The deeper intimacy grows, the more terrifying the thought of losing it becomes. At first, closeness feels like a gift. You finally have someone who understands you, who shares your life, who makes the world feel less lonely. But as that bond deepens, so does the fear of what would happen if it were taken away. And that fear, if left unchecked, begins to distort love into something else entirely. Instead of cherishing the connection, you start clinging to it. Instead of enjoying the presence of your partner, you start obsessing over the possibility of their absence. This fear of abandonment often hides beneath the surface. You don't wake up one morning and say, "I'm terrified they'll leave me." Instead, it shows up in subtle behaviors. Maybe you find yourself checking their phone when they're not looking. Maybe you feel anxious when they don't reply to your message quickly enough. Maybe you question their every interaction with the opposite sex, not because they've given you concrete reasons to distrust them, but because the idea of losing them is unbearable. The deeper the intimacy, the more your mind begins to equate their presence with your stability. And when stability feels threatened, panic sets in. What's dangerous about this is how it twists love into control. You tell yourself you're just being protective, that it's only because you care so much, but the reality is that fear drives behaviors that can suffocate the relationship. Jealousy grows, not from evidence, but from insecurity. Boundaries get crossed in the name of wanting to be close. You demand constant reassurance, not because love requires it, but because fear demands it. And in trying so hard to hold on, you risk pushing the other person away. The irony is that the fear of abandonment often becomes the very reason relationships collapse. The more you let that fear dictate your actions, the more it erodes trust. Your partner starts to feel controlled instead of loved, monitored instead of respected. And slowly, the closeness that intimacy created turns into suffocation. The very thing you were afraid of, losing them, becomes more likely because the relationship is no longer built on freedom and trust, but on fear and control. This fear also shows up in quieter, less obvious ways. It's in the silence when you want to speak up about something that bothers you but don't, because you're scared it might push them away. It's in the way you minimize your needs, telling yourself they're not that important, because deep down you're afraid that being too much will cause them to leave. It's in the way you accept things you shouldn't, because the pain of compromise feels safer than the terror of abandonment. Over time, these small acts of self-betrayal pile up, and the relationship becomes less about love and more about fear management. Another layer to this is how fear of abandonment can tie back to old wounds. Sometimes it's not just about the partner you're with. It's about the childhood where love felt inconsistent, or the past relationship where someone left without warning. Those unresolved fears get projected onto the present, and intimacy only magnifies them. Because the closer someone gets to you, the more they touch those old scars, and the more terrified you become of repeating the pain. But the truth is, intimacy without risk doesn't exist. The possibility of loss is built into the very act of loving someone. That's what makes love so precious in the first place, because there are no guarantees. The challenge is learning to embrace that risk without letting it control you. To love someone deeply while still remembering that your worth and your stability don't disappear if they walk away. Because when fear drives love loses its freedom. But when you accept the risk of abandonment and still choose to be vulnerable, that's where intimacy finds its purest form. The dark side of intimacy here isn't the closeness itself. It's what happens when closeness awakens fear. It's the way love can turn into possession, openness into control, devotion into desperation. And unless we confront that fear, it will quietly run the relationship, making us cling so tightly that the very thing we're afraid to lose slips right through our hands. Intimacy has a way of creating comfort, and comfort can feel like the ultimate prize in a relationship. There's something deeply satisfying about knowing someone so well that words aren't always needed, about slipping into routines together, about feeling at home in each other's presence. That kind of familiarity is beautiful, but it carries a hidden danger. Comfort can become a trap. When closeness turns into complacency, growth slows down, and both people risk settling into versions of themselves that are smaller than who they're meant to be. In the early days of a relationship, there's excitement. You're learning, discovering, constantly challenged by the newness of the connection. You're attentive to how you show up. You put effort into communication. You're willing to step out of your comfort zone because everything feels alive. But as intimacy grows, routines form. You begin to predict each other's moves, finish each other's sentences, know exactly how the evening will unfold. And while that predictability is soothing, it can also numb the very spark that once made the relationship vibrant. The darker side of this comfort is that it often discourages confrontation. You don't want to rock the boat, so you avoid difficult conversations. You let small frustrations slide, not because they don't matter, but because raising them feels like too much effort, too much risk. Over time, unspoken issues pile up beneath the surface, buried under the illusion of peace. The relationship looks calm on the outside, but inside, both people are shrinking. One is holding back their needs, the other is coasting along, and neither is being pushed to grow. What makes this so destructive is that growth is uncomfortable by nature. It requires honesty, risk, and change. But when intimacy provides too much comfort, it's easy to trade growth for ease. You stop pursuing new dreams because you don't want to disrupt the dynamic. You stop challenging each other's bad habits because it's easier to stay quiet. You stop exploring new ways to connect because the old patterns are good enough. And little by little, the relationship becomes less about thriving together and more about simply maintaining a fragile equilibrium. This comfort over growth mindset can also erode individuality. If you never step outside of the bubble you've created, you stop learning about yourself in new contexts. You stop testing your limits, stop pursuing personal passions, stop stretching into the unknown. And while that may keep things peaceful, it also breeds stagnation. You're not the same person you were when the relationship started. But if growth is sacrificed, you end up clinging to a version of yourself that no longer feels alive. Another hidden cost of comfort is that it lowers standards. You convince yourself that predictability is enough, that passion isn't necessary, that connection doesn't need to be deepened. And because intimacy provides security, you tolerate less effort, less attentiveness, less intentionality. What once was a relationship fueled by curiosity and excitement becomes one running on autopilot. The tragedy is that by the time many people realize it, years have passed and they find themselves asking, how did we get here? When did we stop trying? The truth is, real intimacy should never make you smaller. It should push you to grow, not just as a couple, but as individuals. The most fulfilling relationships are the ones where comfort and growth coexist, where you feel safe enough to be vulnerable, but challenged enough to evolve. That means having hard conversations even when it's uncomfortable. It means encouraging each other to pursue goals that exist outside the relationship. It means refusing to let routines replace intentional connection. The dark side of intimacy, when comfort becomes the priority, is that it tricks you into believing stillness is stability. But stability without growth is stagnation. And stagnation, no matter how peaceful it looks, eventually erodes love from the inside out. Intimacy isn't meant to be a hiding place from growth. It's meant to be the safest place to grow.